right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on episode 136 of Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. I have my two regular co-hosts, Ian Kummer, coming from a suburb in Moscow. I believe it's, 7 p.m. there, Ian?
Yes, 7 p.m. Moscow Standard Time.
So it's not morning in Moscow, but I'm not 9 a.m. West Coast time. It's morning for me. And Carlo Parcelli is noon East Coast time in the, what do we call that? The
Satan's anus.
Satan's anus, Washington, D.C. And special guest, returning friend of the show, Chris Black. He's an expert in international law. He has been gracious enough to join us for our 136th episode. I have entitled this episode The Incompetent Empire. That's a reference to the biggest news of the past day or two that everyone is talking about. It's the inclusion of Jeffrey Goldberg from The Atlantic on this encrypted signals app where they were discussing bombing Yemen before the bombing actually took place. And they were including, they included incompetently this journalist. So when I first saw the breaking news, I kind of thought it was a hyper-partisan story and not a real story. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that it is, kind of a big deal. Insofar as it just really reveals the incompetence of how our empire functions, right? Like this is real shit where we're literally dropping bombs and killing people, and the way that this comes about is just kind of preposterously incompetent. That's my basic take on the whole thing. But I want to bring you guys in. Who would like to share their opinion on go ahead, Ian.
I don't know. I would take a less harsh. I'd say my position on it is less harsh. It sounds like from the pre-show discussions we had, we don't have a lot of technical detail besides that it occurred in a signal conversation, and Waltz, not the Democrat Waltz, the National Security Advisor Waltz, or one of his aides is one of the people who added Goldberg, who's worked with the Atlantic Council, right? The Atlantic Council.
Atlantic Monthly Magazine.
Yeah, the Atlantic Magazine.
The Atlantic Magazine, not the Atlantic Council. I saw Atlantic as Atlantic Council. Okay, good. So I didn't read in depth on it, except I'll say the government does have their own Blackberries. I don't know what. Actually, I guess they're not Blackberries anymore. They're phones or smartphones or whatever they're using. So government phones exist still. So. It's I was a little surprised by that, but it's believable they're using Signal because Signal is an end-to-end encrypted platform. So, and they could be using Signal. They could be having these conversations on their government devices. So it's not necessarily just the existence of the group doesn't necessarily break any rules as long as they're following the framework of what's allowed and what's not allowed. The mistake, of course, is adding Goldberg. But I don't know. I think it's an overblown story, if you will. And it's definitely a story that it would, let's be honest, if it was the reverse, if it was a Biden department, Defense Department person who had, like if it was Austin's team who had added a journal or Fox News journalist, let's say, to the group by accident, the Republicans would be raising hell about it and demanding people be fired. And it's just Democrats are doing the same thing. They want Hegseth and Waltz, want them out. So it's not a surprise. I don't think anything's going to come of it. And I also think it's an overblown story. That's my 2 cents on
that. Well, I think it's more than in a way it's an overblown story, but another way it's not. I guess I'm humming and hawing. But if this is a result of incompetence, it shows they're incompetent in making that connection with this journalist and allowing him into the conversation, and shows that they're negligent about national security and their own war plans. But if it's not a result of negligence, then there's something else going on, and it may be something else is going on. But if you get into the actual conversation revealed in those texts, the excerpts I've seen on the BBC, especially because they print them out quite extensively. It's like a bunch of high school boys sitting around discussing how to wipe out the other team, and it's juvenile the way they speak. But they also insult. The big news in Europe and in the UK is that they insult the UK and EU several times in their conversation. As you know, with the Russians released, I think it was the Russians hacked Victoria Nuland's phone in the Maidan coup in 2014, in which she said, "Fuck the EU." And this is being repeated now by the Trump team, and it's now being revealed to Europe. So they've been insulted again. So I think it has wider repercussions in that regard, because now they're saying this is how they talk about us behind closed doors. And of course, there was no discussion in the group in this conversation about the legality of what they're doing or the morality of what they're doing. There's no discussion of that whatsoever. They're just going to drop bombs on people and kill people. So the situation.
Whose phone is that?
It's not mine.
Oh, I'm taking care of it. Rosalie got it.
So the situation in the U.S., it seems to me, is yes, the Democrats are going to make a big thing about it and are.
Yeah.
And it may have effects also on the Russian perspective and the Chinese perspective. The Chinese are making some not strange comments, but comments suggesting that how can you trust anything when you discuss anything with the Americans when any conversation you have with them may be leaked. This may affect the negotiations going on between Russia and the United States right now. How can the Russians trust anything going on in the rooms they're speaking in, not knowing whether something else is going to be leaked about those conversations? So, and of course, you get the European and the UK effect, which is they're not happy about what they're reading in this conversation. So it's going to have political effects that way. But what I can't understand Goldberg's version of events. He says he got out of the blue a request on his Signal app by Waltz, the National Security Advisor, to connect with him. So he did. But he never says what a normal journalist or any person would do if they got a request for a connection from a high figure like that, saying, "Thanks for the connection. What would you like to talk about?" No. He just connects. Doesn't say a thing for several days. And that's odd. Why? And how did Waltz get his number? Where'd that come from? Why Goldberg? And then days later, he suddenly looped into this text conversation. And instead of him, when he's in the loop, interjecting, he's saying, "Excuse me, am I supposed to be in this?" He doesn't say a damn thing. He just lets it run without saying a word. And he's in the group. Why didn't he take part in the conversation since he's invited? Why didn't he say, "Excuse me, people, you want me to be on this?" Or, I mean, what's... then they could have corrected it, but he didn't say a thing. Okay, he's tempted to... Let's say we take him at his word. He's like really curious, and he thought that was a trap maybe, or it wasn't real till he got going. And then the bombings took place, he realized it wasn't a spoof. The whole thing was real. I don't quite buy that, but maybe it's true. Or did somebody set up Waltz and hack the system and make the connection outside of Waltz and then loop him in later into this conversation? Are we looking at a deep state, democratically based, or some other intelligence group attempt to discredit the Trump team and to make them look incompetent and to reveal this conversation? They say it seems to be authentic. Hegseth says it was, and I don't believe him. I think that the conversation actually took place, but how the connection was made is very strange to me. And it looks like you could see it as an attempt by someone else. I don't know what they're going to say. There's going to be hearings today, I understand, in Congress with all these people. And they may say that we didn't do it. Somebody hacked the system and linked us up. We weren't aware of it, so it wasn't us. Or they may confess and say, yeah, we fucked up and Waltz should be fired or resign or something. But there's something strange going on here. Why Goldberg? Goldberg is one of these guys who was a real cheerleader for the Iraq war. He was one of the most vocal calling for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. He was in the RDF. He's connected to Israel. I don't necessarily think that's necessarily involved here, but he's been very critical of Trump, and he's very connected to the Democrats. I mean, why would Mike Waltz connect with this particular journalist and get his number out of the blue just by accident? It doesn't make sense to me. That can't be by accident. But why didn't he get a Fox guy? He'd be more likely to have a Fox journalist on his signal group, and he accidentally tapped it in. I mean, there's something else going on here, and I'm not sure what it is, but I suspect there's something else going on.
Perhaps it's greater incompetence.
Maybe.
They might have confused the Atlantic magazine with the Atlantic Council,
Possibly.
which does give input
Yes.
into those kind of meetings.
That's
And they might have assumed that this, out of the fact that a lot of these people in the cabinet are newbies, that this guy is from the Atlantic Council, not from the Atlantic Monthly. There could be that. I agree entirely with what Chris is saying about the disrespect that's being shown. Once again, being shown Europe and virtually the rest of the world by the Trump administration, given the Greenland situation and the way they're approaching that, sending a Vance's wife, and this group of people to Greenland when clearly Greenland does not want them there, and that's real chutzpah. That's major league gall on their part. I don't want to change the subject too much, but if you want to talk about incompetence, we also have to look at the domestic dimension of what's going on with Musk and his chainsaw to the
well,
the
that's why I think that there may be more to this than meets the eye. I think there may be a rolling coup attempt taking place here. People are I can understand from looking outside from in Canada here what's going on down in your country. The government cuts and the Doge and all that. I get the sense there's a lot of pissed off people in very high places who don't like what's going on and want to stop it. And they want the war against Russia to continue. And I would not put it past them to be engaged in setting up a scenario where they can eliminate this team somehow, one way or the other. And the idea about them maybe making a mistake thinking they were connected with the Atlantic Council would make sense if they sent a connection to the Atlantic Monthly magazine itself. But they didn't. They sent it to Jeffrey Goldberg's personal account with the name Goldberg. And you can't mistake that. So Goldberg's history in connection with the Israeli IDF, Mossad, and his work promoting the war in Iraq and several other wars, being connected to the Clintons and the Obamas very heavily, makes me suspicious something else is going on here. But who knows?
So
I think it's going to develop.
Initials of Jeffrey Goldberg, JG. Apparently, there is some cabinet level official. I don't know if it's the Commerce Secretary or something that has the same initials. And so one of the explanations CNN was passing off was that somebody just haphazardly was looking through people linked to a Signal and then saw the initials and was assuming it was this other cabinet person. I mean, who knows if that's, how it happened. I kind of take it at face value that it was a fuck up, that it was incompetence and they made a mistake. But, we can't rule out other explanations. But I did want to highlight, I wanted to focus on a couple things. So number one was the EU, all of the people talking on Signal, definitely. So Vance and Hegseth, both were referring specifically to how they have to bail out the EU because they're talking about the shipping that goes through the Red Sea there and how that's negatively affecting, the economy of the EU. And so these people have a genuine belief that, the EU is freeloading off of U.S. Defense, right? Call it defense. It's not really defense, but U.S. empire. So the EU is benefiting from the U.S. empire and not, paying their fair share. So this is a consistent theme that we see from the Trump administration. I think there's some validity to it. There's some truth to it, but you can see that that's what they really believe behind closed doors. And that's one of the things that we see from this exchange that they had. But the other thing that I wanted to focus on was also like what Chris had said about the locker room, kind of level of discussion and planning. And they really just had a vote. And some people voted against bombing, but a majority voted for the bombing. And it was settled, yeah, we're going to bomb. And it was as simple as that. And, it's just demoralizing to see behind the scenes how the sausage is made, how the imperial sausage is made. It doesn't lend any kind of confidence in how they're running this empire. Like, it's really awful. And so the incompetence, I mean, I didn't do it justice when I was talking the first time, but it's really that's the biggest takeaway. This level of incompetence and how they decide these things. There's no actual plan. I mean, do they think they're gonna get Yemen to back down by dropping these bombs? Like, they're out of their minds. But they're just not smart people, and they're making decisions off the cuff. And they're not going to be successful. This is not going to successfully further their agenda vis-a-vis creating really greater Israel. I mean, that's what this is all about: getting Iran and Yemen to stand down so greater Israel can be created. And Israel will be the undisputed regional hegemon, and they're going to have this great economic system with Saudi Arabia and all the Gulf states, and this new Gaza. What is it called? Trump Gaza. Where you have this beachfront property for real rich people, like Monaco, only in Gaza. Like, this is their big plan, and they're never going to achieve. They're way too incompetent to, achieve this agenda. But okay. So that was my second attempt to share my thoughts on that issue. Yeah, go ahead.
I would say, as far as disrespecting the EU, I mean, Newland herself, that's 2014 or 2013 news. Europe has never cared about, maybe they do care, but they're quiet about it. They still kiss the ring. So it's not new that the American establishment thinks, has a very low opinion of the European allies, as they're called. And no one protested as long as the gravy kept flowing. Now that the gravy is not flowing, now they're upset about being disrespected. So I would say it's not really an issue of Trump disrespect, because, let's be honest, Biden administration and Obama administration and Bush administration, probably Clinton, And first Bush, I don't think that disrespect is new, but Europeans accepted it as long as the gravy was flowing. Now the gravy has been threatened, not even been cut off, but being threatened with being cut off. Now they're
the other thing is that what they said amongst themselves about the bailing out the EU is false, because they're that incompetent and ignorant that they don't know that the Houthis weren't blocking any shipments at that point when they decided to attack them. They had stopped all their attacks on shipping, and they were not attacking any shipping except Israeli-bound shipping. So they were not bailing out the EU at all, because EU shipping, regular shipping going through that region into the Suez Canal and back and forth, were not being attacked. So they weren't bailing out the EU like they think they were. I mean, if they're that ignorant, they don't know what the real facts are, then the world really is in trouble, because they're basing actions on false premises. And then that means they don't understand what's really happening. And they react. I mean, and why did they start this attack? Because at that time, when the first attack was made by the United States and Britain, by the way, at the same time, British planes took part. There was no Houthi attacks on shipping. It was only their warning that if the Israelis began an attack on Gaza, they would restart it. Wow.
Well, as far as we know, the Israelis are. It does seem like there's a pretty concrete plan in place to re-enter Gaza. So,
well, yeah, they've done that. That's true.
Yeah, and the ceasefire had ended, right? The ceasefire had officially ended when this took place. But I think from, the perspective of, Vance and Hegseth that were talking about how they're bailing out the EU again is just basically, the premise that it's the United States is responsible for ensuring global trade is protected. Like, that's what they think. And so when they are, using U.S. resources to maintain this opening of global trade and keeping global trade from functioning normally, they're thinking, well, how come it's got to be us? Why isn't the EU stepping up to maintain this, this economic system that they're benefiting from? I think that's just the basic perspective that they have. And yeah, exactly how much the EU benefits or was being, how much money they were losing because none of their, ships were able to trade with Israel is a good question. And it's probably very little, but I'm just saying that I think from their perspective, what they were complaining about was that the EU is just never, sacrificing or investing in, the maintenance of the global, the global economy and maintaining freedom of trade, freedom of navigation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's always the U.S. and they feel they resent that. And they see that as freeloading but anyway, I don't want to argue their case for them, but I'm just saying, I think that's, how they kind of see it. And that's the explanation for what they were saying in this chat.
But again, it's bizarre because this idea that they're subsidizing the EU or the EU is ripping them off is bizarre. The EU, Germany, especially, and the EU countries have sabotaged themselves at the request of the United States by cutting off cheap oil and gas supplies from Russia to please the Americans, whose war this is against Russia was started by the Americans. That was the United States wanted this war against Russia. They kowtowed their vassal states in Europe and Canada to go along with it. They've invested a lot of money in it and men, a lot of resources. They've willingly let the Americans sabotage the gas supply to Germany and Europe, rest of Europe, by blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline and sanctions. The economy in Europe is crashing because of these sacrifices the Europeans have made for this American war on Russia. And yet the Americans have the nerve to say that now that they want to create a separate piece of Russia because they're losing the war and want out to allocate resources wherever else, China, Iran, or whatever, or they got some other plan against Russia. It's not clear. Sure, the Europeans are pissed off. I mean, if you got me, you roped me into a war to attack this big country, and we're going to do it, and then suddenly when things go bad, you try and back out of it because you change the regime. Well, wouldn't you be pissed off? I mean, who's ripping off who? Who's ripping off who here? Whose war was this? And the Europeans have devoted a lot of resources to help this war, and they got their own little things. They want to break up Russia and take a piece of the action. There must be secret treaties among them, sharing who's going to get what if Russia ever fell and collapsed. I'm sure they exist. And now this new regime comes into the United States, suddenly wants to reverse everything, and like in Canada, Trump's threatening to attack Canada when he says annex. There's only one way you can annex Canada, that's to invade and occupy it. And yet the Canadian government acts as if they're still taking orders from Biden. They still attack Russia. They insult Russia. They did that the other day in Moscow. The Canadian ambassador made some strange comment about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They're insulting China, sanctions, India. Everything the United States wanted, they're still doing, even though the Americans are threatened to attack Canada. I get the sense that the Canadian government and maybe some of the Europe and the UK government are still dealing with what we call the deep state, bypassing Trump and still taking orders because Trump's to them a temporary phenomenon. They survive 4 years of this, the war is going to continue. And I think the Russians are making well, I'm sure they're aware of this, but the Russians have to be aware that this government's only in power maybe for 4 years, and anything they sign and with them is only going to last a short time.
Yeah, the U.S. is agreement incapable. Like, I mean, anything Trump does is subject to being completely ripped up, if at least in 4 years, if not sooner. So yeah, anybody that thinks they can come to any sort of real concrete agreement with the United States, and that's part of the problem. I mean, that's part of the problem that China and Russia have to deal with. Ian, you had some thoughts earlier when Chris was talking about the Europe, and personally, I have no sympathy for Europe. I am so it's just amusing to see. Because they shouldn't have gone along with the United States. They should have demanded their own sovereignty. They shouldn't have been sacrificing this whole time. So fuck them. Fuck them. But anyway, you probably have similar thoughts.
Well, so the problem with the European perspective, they're very upset about Trump accusing them of freeloading. But, if we look at the Victoria Nuland and Biden interference in Ukraine and the Normandy format in Ukraine. There's only two options here. Either the United States walked all over Europe, or that's what the Europeans wanted all along, and their pretense of negotiating peace was deliberate deception. That's really the only two fair interpretations of Nuland's statements. Because Nuland is not head of state. She wasn't even the Secretary of State. She's nobody. She's not. I don't think it's really even fair or accurate to say, well, she walked all over Merkel and the actual heads of state involved in negotiating an attempted peace at the Minsk agreements and all that. So we have to ask, how much is it really even a true statement that this is a U.S. war, not a European war? Because yes, the U.S. is up to its neck in participating in it. That's true. But it doesn't really even advance American interests. It advances European tribal disputes. That's literally how I would describe it. European tribal disputes, because they love to portray themselves as this big bloc. But I don't think Europe. They present Europe as this unified economic and political bloc, but when it's not, Europe is a collection of French and Croatians and Germans. It's all these different tribes who really, honestly, seem to hate each other just as much as they hate anyone else. So it's really not unified. So the USA is the big gorilla, that the neighborhood gorilla, or not even the neighborhood gorilla, the gorilla down the street who they brought in to be the muscle in their regional political interests. So that's my interpretation.
Yeah, no, they've appreciated the U.S. for working to create unity in Europe, where otherwise, without the United States, there would not be unity, and the centrifugal forces would have kept them from being a bloc. And so, and now they're worried that that's going to happen now that the U.S. is pivoting to Asia. But yeah, I just have really little sympathy for the EU, and they chose to be the poodle and lapdog of the United States, and so they're going to just have to deal with that, and it's not going to be easy. What they need to do is they need to put in governments that represent the people. I mean, that's exactly what we need to do here in the United States as well, is put in governments that represent the people. I mean, it's easier said than done. That they're dealing with all the propaganda that we have to deal with in this country. They're dealing with all the money going to, to divide the society along all these different lines. And you have, the right wing, right, is now resurgent because they're somewhat semi rational with regards to their approach to Russia. AFD doesn't, want to have a war with Russia. And so it's just a problem. Like, and it's the problem of oligarchy. It's the problem when the elites have the ability to manipulate the political system due to their ownership of the economic system. And they just have all the resources, all the media power, all the wealth, and they can use that, to manipulate people and keep the working class divided and keep actual democracy from happening. I mean, it's the same problem that we have in this country. But
well, if you needed and you knew I was a snake moment when the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, that should have been an indication to Europe that they were dealing, how could they have not already realized that they were dealing with a snake? Because that not only served U.S. purposes as regards Russia, but it also weakened Europe exponentially.
Yeah.
And caused them to have to spend far more on their energy. And
yeah,
that was planned deep in the bowels of U.S. intelligence years ago. I'm sure that's an aspect of the.
So I think one of the reasons they got away with that is because the West saw for a long time that Merkel was going to be leaving, and they needed to figure out who was going to replace them. And they spent a long time, invested heavily in making sure that the government that replaced Merkel would be a total lackey, which was the Greens, right? They built up the Greens, they invested in them, they got them in power. And the thing about the Greens is it wasn't that they were green, it's that they were anti-Russia. And they could be counted on to toe the line and do the bidding of the United States. And let's face it, Germany was the EU, right? Germany was the mainstay of the EU. And as Germany went, so the rest of the EU would go. But the US knew that they could, with impunity, sever this German infrastructure, this German energy infrastructure, without the Germans saying anything, because they worked to put puppets in government that would allow that, and so they that's why they did it, just for that purpose. But so we've been not to totally change the subject, we have been away from broadcasting for several weeks, so there's been a lot of events that have transpired that we haven't discussed. So we've focused so far on the big news of the past couple days. But generally speaking, looking at the bigger picture, what have been the biggest events and movements in the past few weeks that are really most significant and that we really need to tackle? Any thoughts?
You mean worldwide or in worldwide, or I mean here in Canada?
Yeah.
Well, The big event for me was going to Cuba. And I just want to mention Cuba briefly. I don't want to take over the conversation with that, but I was there for several weeks. And I mentioned that because you mentioned the ADF in Germany. And while we were there, there were quite a few Germans and Russians there. We met all the Germans we spoke to were from the former DDR, Eastern Germany. All of them were voting for the ADF. All of them were supporters of the USSR. All of them said they regretted and hated the fact that unification took place. They missed the DDR. They hate Germany as a state, what the West Germans took over. They said they treat us like second-class citizens. They have a different attitude towards life than we do. It's all about money instead of social life and social society, which we grew up with under the influence of the DDR and USSR. They support Russia. They're anti-NATO, and they were all communists. And this reflects what I met Germans 2 years ago in Cuba. I met a lot of Germans, and they were all from the Eastern Germany again. All former communists. Some had high official positions in the Communist Party and state. They were quite old, some of them, but some were younger. But I think a lot of the left vote in Germany, which could have gone to the Linke or Wagenknecht's party, the communist left, swung over in Eastern Germany to the ADF because the communist presence there is not very strong. So I think you get a lot of left people in the ADF. It's not just right wing. And they say, yeah, there were some Nazis in it because of immigration policies and so on. But a lot of left-wing communist people have joined the ADF or support the ADF because we're against the war, we support Russia, we're against this and that. So it's a mixed bag. But and the Russians, there were quite a few Russians there. We met some farmers from Kursk who were there on vacation, nice fellows. But leery of me when they asked where we were from, and I said Canada. They wanted to back away. Oh, you guys. Aren't you one of the countries attacking us? I said, yeah. Anyway, broken conversation. They became very friendly. Yeah, they became very friendly after a while. They're very sympathetic. But Cuba itself is facing a lot of difficulties, but the electric grid is being restored. When we were there, the Chinese, some months before, had brought in 60 or 70 tons of electrical gear, transformers and electrical equipment. When we were there, they brought in another big shipment, and the electric grid is now being restored. And over the island, it's basically being restored, but they're rebuilding it from the ground up with all new equipment. And what they're doing in many regional locations outside the big cities is setting up micro substations using solar power and other forms of green energy, gas, and so on. So they're trying to modernize it and make it state of the art. And they're proceeding very quickly. They got 50,000 engineers working in Cuba rebuilding this grid. And it's going pretty quickly.
Russians too, right? Like Russia is sending engineers and they're on the ground.
I haven't heard too much about the Russians. There are Russians there, Russian engineers, but most of the Cubans talk about the Chinese assistance because that's being material. There are a lot of Russian tourists there. But the revolutionary spirit, you hear some rumblings of discontent, that's for sure. But when we were there in Havana, they had a 1 million-person march to celebrate the commemoration of Jose Marti. 1 million people marched in Havana in a torchlight parade at night. It's very impressive. 1 million people. They've had a big demonstration by all the university students across Cuba supporting Palestine. So I got the sense that despite the difficulties, and they're real, the revolutionary spirit is still strong, and I think the country will survive. And they're opening up more private businesses. They're going more the way the Chinese have gone. So now they've opened up, I think, several thousand private companies. You see cafes now, restaurants, private hotels. There are about 3,000 or 4,000 private companies have been allowed to operate under government license, electrical, computer engineering, software, agricultural products, and so on and so forth. So they're moving towards what the Chinese have done, allowing some private capital to operate, vent some of the unrest and frustration among the people while maintaining control by the party. So, and this is what the Chinese have done. And I think that's where Cuba's going.
Well, that's a good report. I'm happy to hear that all of that. I know friend of the show, Charles McKelvey, lives there most of the time, and he said that the government's plan is that by 2030, 40% of the electrical grid will be basically solar panels. It'll be solar. So 40% of the grid will be solar, which will really lower, the stress on the fuel oil portion of the grid that takes fuel oil to run the energy processing plants currently. And that's why they're being overtaxed, right? And so you've had several power outages, several nationwide power collapses just this year alone. And it's due to the increased sanctions, because Obama lifted the sanctions extensively. And then when Trump came in, he reinstituted them. And Biden left Trump's, draconian sanctions in place. And then I think recently Trump has even made them harsher just this year. And so it's tough. It's a struggle for the Cuban people. But I agree with you that I think their future is very bright. I think it might be some tough years, under Trump, because he's really going to try to do his best to make their lives miserable. They're emboldened by what happened in Syria. They're going to go after Venezuela big time. We heard J.D. Vance no, it wasn't Vance. It was Don Jr. was talking to Eric Prince in an interview, talking about their big plans to regime change Venezuela coming up. So, it's
one thing, because I talked about quite a few Cubans, and some of them had family members who've gone to Mexico and tried because they want to go up to the States. So that is taking place. Some people just get frustrated and want a better life and leave. And Cubans can leave. They got the money. They can fly to Mexico or anywhere. But another thing I should say is that the first 2 weeks I was in Cuba, the government declared a state of emergency and declared that the government has calling on the people to prepare for a total people's war against the United States. They expect the worst from Trump. And while those 2 weeks, they conducted nationwide military exercises across the island. And every day we were seeing flying over our heads MiG jets streaking towards Florida, like a dozen of them at the time. You can see them flying over, bang, an hour later to come back. And they were doing that 3 or 4 times a day, every day for 2 weeks. It was very strange to see these jets streaking towards Florida with and then them flying back, and then doing mock drills and combat in the sky above your heads. So they hope that Trump won't do it, but they're preparing for the worst.
So I can't help but read our comments, and I was thinking, so Mr. Biuso suggested that we're maybe overestimating the power and influence of the U.S. and EU. He says greater scrutiny should be focused on a national global capital. I would definitely agree to a certain point with Joe. But I would argue that, global capital has vehicles that they use, right? They use the state apparatus, and currently global capitalism has hitched itself to the state apparatus of the United States. And it's the United States and the United States military, the United States economy that they use as their vehicle for, global domination, et cetera. And so definitely we got to look past the actual government and understand the forces that own and are utilizing the government. But nevertheless, they are actually using a government, a military, and an economy to further their interests. And so, I think, you know, the U.S. does have a significant influence over the U.S. government. The Trump administration has significant influence over events, even though they're also being, you know, influenced by global capital. And I mean, global capital is the reason that they're, you know, engaged in what they're doing in the Middle East, in Ukraine, in China. But yeah, so I'm getting us far afield. What major developments again over the past 3 weeks? What other major developments over the past 3 weeks? Or we can talk more about Cuba, Chris, if you weren't done talking about Cuba.
No, I'm done talking about Cuba. That the fact it's become a BRICS partner is encouraging. So I agree with you. I'm optimistic, although they're going to face difficulties, that's for sure. Yeah. And Trump, I think, has now blocked Cubans in America sending money back to Cuba, which is going to be a big hardship.
That's interesting.
I guess we're all watching outside from, like, my perspective, and outside the United States, we're all watching the Trump regime trying to dismantle certain government agencies and lay off people. It looks like the capitalists have become naked and almost fascistic by pushing the law to its limits or tending to ignore the law. And they're attacking the working class by cutting programs which seem to be beneficial to the working class. And Trump seems to have this whole tariff war. He's putting it in place for two express reasons. A, to try and force American industry to be protected so it can be built up inside the United States. And I think that can't happen. But also to raise revenue, because he wants to cut the income tax for the rich people. He wants to reduce the income tax to a very low flat rate.
Yeah.
And so he has to make up the money from some other source, which excise or import taxes. And that's what he's doing, which beggars the working class people who have to pay the price, but may support some rich guys. But
yeah, no,
so
it's basically handouts to his rich friends. I mean, without a doubt, it's throwing the working classes under the bus, and that's what a flat tax would do. If he does implement a flat tax, it's going to disproportionately affect working class people. Carlo, I know you have been on a long hiatus for a while. You're dealing with some health issues, and it seemed much improved, which we're all thankful for, and we're happy that you're joining us. But let me ask you though, just, you know, as you are convalescing and, you know, you have some time on your hands and you're watching things unfold, like, what are the major you know, thoughts that are going through your mind as a wise, what are you, almost 50 now, probably?
Well,
wise man.
Thanks for asking, but really for me, it's what Chris has just hit upon, and that is the way that the Trump administration and Elon Musk are handling this breakup of the U.S. government. I mean, first of all, the first thing that comes to my mind is they're not willing to touch the military-industrial complex.
No.
That's not where it's going. It's affecting, obviously, people like me, and my health care. My health hasn't been good on a personal level. But the way they're going about it is, I thought that when Milei, that asshole from Argentina, gave Musk that buzzsaw, that chainsaw, that was a perfect metaphor for what they're doing. Because if you ask Mitt Romney, this is not the way you downsize a major corporation. That's not how you go about it. He did very effectively. That's the way Mitt Romney made tens of millions of dollars for himself, by effectively downsizing major corporations. But he did it in what what was a very subtle and hardly noticeable way, unless you were a victim or gained advantage from the game. Whereas this Musk, there's no protocol. You just go in, and you just, you just knock everything over, and everything falls, falls down, collapses, then you just sort of make excuses. I mean, Musk is going around saying, we're going to make mistakes, but you can't make mistakes with people's lives. I live in the Washington area, and many people have federal jobs that are being cut here. Many people I know are afraid they're going to lose their jobs or their benefits. But that's not where it ends. Every guy that owns a lunch counter that sold his lunches to federal executives or federal people, work people, is going to lose his livelihood. Cab drivers, everybody. And then when you look at it, you go, well, what's Musk's game here? Well, it seems like he wants to get in, muscle in, and become the first trillionaire, and nothing really matters to him. That he's kind of like he's a psycho who he's got, the driverless cars. Now they've become, the DC government has just allowed them to operate on their roads in DC, like, driverless cars. Verizon had a contract, $2 billion contract, that was up for that the government didn't want to renew. But the Trump administration didn't want to renew, and Musk jumped in and said, "I'll take it. I'll take that contract." So there seems to be, on the one hand, this kind of, let's just break this up regardless. Let's just collapse this system on the using the rubric of corruption. When even it's demonstrated that there's very little corruption going on. I mean, it's not like the military. They've attempted to what's the term I'm looking for? They've attempted to take the military's expenditures and test them for accuracy any number of times, and they can't do it. It's there's no way you can get there's no way you can get behind the amount of corruption that's involved there, but that involves private corporations. And so you have to, with the military, you have to almost immediately, since much of the funding goes to private corporations, you have immediately to start looking at the books of these private corporations. Well, that's not going to happen. There's no validity to any of this notion of corruption. I mean, certainly some corruption must take place, but certainly there's no validity to the whole notion that the U.S. government is operating in corruption, and that's why it's $33 trillion in debt. I mean, it's not that, pointing out that, that $10,000 was set aside for transgender mice when it turns out to be transgenic mice. That just goes to show you how sloppy and ignorant these people are. Who's going to jump at $10,000, even if it was transgender mice? Who's going to? It's like the numbers they're throwing out don't add up to opinions of what's really needed to close the gap on this $33 trillion debt. So something else is going on. I'd be interested in opening it up.
Well, I was since you raised that, the Oval Meeting office with Zelensky about the peace negotiations, and Zelensky is dressed down by Vance and Trump in public. And one of the complaints Trump had about Zelensky was his form of dressing in his usual, I'm just fresh from the front in the war zone, jumpsuit and sweater and so on. And yet, Elon Musk walks around the Oval Office every day in a baseball cap, a t-shirt, and a dirty raincoat. Nothing's said. I mean, it's just, yeah, you're right. I think the image of him with Milei receiving that buzzsaw and dancing around the stage with it and saying, this is what we're going to do. And the fact that he was hobnobbing with Milei, who was an outright fascist, and he's destroying Argentina, friends. I mean, it's just destroying Argentina. They're gutting the entire federal service in Argentina. They're shutting down universities. They're shutting down government departments. They're laying off hundreds of thousands of people. And this is what they seem to be wanting to do in your country. Not here yet, but they seem to want to do it in the UK and in Europe to finance this arms buildup to continue the war against Russia. Because it's great that the Russians and Americans are finally talking. It's better than not talking. But I'm not optimistic about anything really coming out of that because I wish something would. But it's quite clear that, yes, the EU and the UK and Canada are vassal states, and they're partly to blame themselves for putting themselves in the box they find themselves in. But they were promised a lot of things. I'm sure when the regimes in the United States have pushed this war, we got to go after Russia and break it up. Then we can go after China. They were promised peace of the action in Russia.
Yeah.
And they went along because they made promises. And I'm sure there are secret treaties we don't know about where they've divvied up. If we can collapse Russia, you're going to get this piece, you're going to get that piece, which is why they're willing to sacrifice their economies right now and lose a lot of money because they hope for bigger returns at the end. There's got to be something in it for them. Mm-hmm. And we don't know what that is. But there are secret treaties in which they've already carved up Russia.
Yeah. And
assigned who's going to get what. So, and Britain has no resources. French, Germans, they have no resources. They find themselves in a situation now which they can't survive for very long without their economies crashing because they have no resources of their own, no mineral resources, no oil and gas reserves. The British their fields have almost run dry. They're in a desperate situation. If they can't take over the resources of Russia and Ukraine, the next century is going to be terrible for them. They're going to just go down to poverty. They can't support their own population. So they want to continue this war because they're in desperate straits. And I think they're going to do everything they can to keep this war going and trying to sabotage these peace talks. Zelensky is obviously, since he's on the outs with the American government, is now being provoked to maintain his stance by the Europeans and the British to be obstructive and not want a peace deal, and which is what's happening. And the Russians faced the problem that, okay, we're talking with the Americans, but how can they have a peace deal with Ukraine when the Ukrainians, their proxies, don't want to play ball? And the Europeans are also involved in this war, don't want to play ball. If the Russians have a deal with the Americans, what does that mean? I know the Russians are looking for bigger fish than just Ukraine. They want NATO rolled back. They want the Aegis systems taken out of Romania and Poland and to secure their borders. So it's a bigger picture for them. But as far as the Ukraine war is concerned, I don't know how they can have a peace deal just with an agreement with the United States itself. And only with the Trump regime, because the other faction in the United States who wants to still push this war is waiting to come back. And they won't be back before too long, in 3 or 4 years, they'll be back. So Russia finds itself they have some hopes, but where is it going to go?
Well, there's
what is Trump trying to do?
there's a military reality, right? And so, you laid out a great analysis of the, intractable aspect of this conflict. And Putin, if anyone, is well aware of that. And that's why the military, hasn't stopped its advance. And so, I think that's the key. At a certain point, there will be a military collapse in Ukraine, and then it's like the Russia will be able to set their own terms, right? I mean, they'll just do it on the battlefield, and it doesn't really matter, what Ukraine wants or what Europe wants.
Right.
But it's intractable. It's, how can you come to an agreement where, anything that is remotely doable, like Putin just stretches out his hands at the maximum extent, he's still thousands of miles away from what Trump could ever agree to, kind of a thing, right? And much less the EU and much less Zelensky. So it really is intractable, but, there's plan B is just to, let Ukraine collapse, and then Russia will dictate realities after that.
Trump.
Go ahead.
Trump won't be involved in any agreement until there's something in it for Trump. Unless he gets, even from the grave, unless he gets his wealth increased exponentially, there won't be an agreement.
He wants to build a strip in Crimea, Witkoff says. He wants to build a Las Vegas type strip in Crimea.
Yeah.
If they make a deal.
Yeah. And
there's that if we roll back NATO.
And he's learning that BlackRock is already BlackRock and Blackstone, which is a fiduciary of.
There's a zero hedge. There's a zero hedge article I was trying to dig up a few minutes ago. I can't find it, unfortunately, or I would share it in the comments. I did some searches for it, but basically, there's this idea that the U.S. government is attempting to string this thing in Ukraine long enough until basically it's meant to avoid a recession in the USA, because it's known that there's a recession in the USA, and the federal government was just fudging the numbers this whole time for the past several years, or we would already be in a recession if it wasn't for these artificial controls. It would have happened already, but they know that. So the hope is that basically they're going to sucker Europe into taking the bulk of the responsibility for Ukraine, and what will happen is capital flight out of the EU into the USA. So that was the theory that got floated on Zero Hedge yesterday, and I think there's a lot of grounds to think that's a good theory. So I don't really agree with the assertion that's just Trump being Trump. I mean, yes, to an extent. When Trump is on Twitter or when Trump's on Truth Social, it's very funny actually to be on a platform that you own. It's actually kind of funny. You think the president is ranting on Truth Social, which is a platform that's also owned, or at least partially owned by him. But anyways, that's Trump being Trump. But I think when it comes to the federal government, it's a mistake to say it's just Trump being a renegade and it's just Trump being Trump. It's the same as saying, Russia is just Putin, and, it's Putin being, a rogue dictator or whatever. I mean, because that's not true. Obviously, there's a political machine behind Putin. It's not just one guy who's a strong man. It's a large. There's an apparatus behind it. It's the same with Trump. There's people behind him, and I think there's a lot of weight behind the idea that it's because it's true. When Trump was just Trump, when it was just citizen Trump, talking, I'll end the war in 24 hours. Of course, he didn't. Well, why? We need to ask why he didn't. Well, because when he's actually in the Oval Office and he's back in the machine, and they say, hey, this is the reality of what's going on, and this is what we want. And he's playing along with it because he could just cut off. He's bullying Ukraine by doing this, flipping the on switch on and off, right? He turns off, said, we're not going to give you any more intelligence. Then they come crawling back and he says, okay, I will allow you to have intelligence again. He's playing that game to bully Ukraine. But the point is he could just pull out because there's no declaration of war. There's no legislation because it wasn't really a legal war to begin with. Biden just decided, okay, we're going to do this. They voted on the spending bills, but it was mostly just the Biden administration. It was an executive decision. You could have a different executive decision to say, we're not going to do it anymore. And they have majorities in both houses anyway. So I think that's what's happening. They're hoping they can manipulate the war to save the U.S. economy and cause capital flight from Europe to the USA.
And that definitely seems like that's been going on under Biden as well, because what were like Siemens and Volkswagen, like a lot of these corporations that were no longer profitable due to the increased energy costs in Germany did come to the United States. There was a handful of them that was reported about under Biden. And so that's definitely one aspect of it. It is hard to know exactly what Trump's plan is because, like you said, he could have ended that conflict, on day one through executive orders. I mean, Starlink could have, Elon Musk could have taken Starlink away. We could have just stopped all weapons and all sharing of intelligence. And he didn't, and he hasn't. And even Elon Musk says we would never threaten removing Starlink. We would never use Starlink as leverage. Never. Like he said that. So what exactly Trump is, after remains to be seen. It is great that he's talking, and it's great to hear Lavrov, for instance, say that our Secretary of State, Little Marco, heard Russia, understood Russia. Like that's what Lavrov is saying. So it's good to have this kind of communication, but to what ends remains a mystery. And we can't. It's best to be pessimistic with Trump, right? I mean, we ought to be pessimistic.
Well, I agree with Ian. I think Ian's right that the whole Western world is has been in a recessionary phase. Capitalism always collapses every 5 or 7 years, and that's long overdue. So, and maybe what's happening. But an indication of what Trump is trying to do with the United States' role in Ukraine is exemplified by the phone call to President Putin asking for him to let those NATO, Ukraine forces, he said, but he's worried about NATO people trapped in Kursk, let them out. And Putin replied, well, they can either surrender or die. It's their choice. But he was worried not about Ukrainian soldiers, but about NATO and American people being in there. And the Russians are reporting they've captured and killed quite a number of Americans and British soldiers in Kursk. So he knows what's going on. The Americans are still involved there. He didn't pull them out. He's trying to rescue them, the ones who are trapped in Kursk, but that means there are other ones all over Ukraine still helping the Ukrainian military fight the war. But up here, the question is, what's Trump's real intention towards Canada? And people are very nervous up here about what he wants to do. So up here you have nobody's buying American products. Nobody. All American alcohol has been removed from every shop. Everybody is refusing to travel to the United States. There's a lot of anger up here towards the United States. And he succeeded in raising a patriotic level I've never seen before in this country. And he's reversed. The right wing in the United States was supporting the opposition in Canada, headed by this guy, Poilievre of the Conservative Party. And they obviously wanted to put him in power. because he's very close to Trump, and his policies are almost as Trump's, a mirror image of Trump's policies. But since his threats to take over Canada, the whole electoral mood has changed. Now it's all swung back towards the Liberal Party. So right now, if the election's held today, the Liberals are going to get a majority in government, whereas right now they only have a minority. And the NDP, the Social Democratic Party, has gone from like 30% of the vote down to 10% because most of the people in the NDP have switched over to the Liberals to make sure that the Conservatives do not get in. Because if the Conservatives get in, they're afraid we're going to lose free health care, free this, free that. And I mean, Trump's calling us a communist state. I even saw Andrei Martyanov say yesterday. I turned him off because he's claimed Canada was a dictatorship. It was just ridiculous crap coming out of some of these people. But so Trump has effectively caused the electoral system here to go back to the people he doesn't want, which is the Liberals. Although on the other hand, the Canadian government still acts as if they're a vassal of the United States, a 51st state, and does everything they want in foreign policy terms. So
Yeah.
Nobody understands what the hell is going on. Why they're threatening to attack us, but we're doing everything they want us to do. What the hell's going on here?
Right. And I mean, not being Canadian, it's kind of a sideshow for me. Like, it's just really a sideshow. And like, I don't ever see like Trump really, putting troops on the ground in Canada and killing Canadians to force Canada to be the 51st state. Because like you said, they already function as if they're our 51st state.
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
what's the point? But I think he wants you guys to sacrifice more, for us. And so he's putting pressure on your government to say, hey, you guys need to fork over more money for us, more sacrifice for our cause, and you're not doing enough. But with Greenland, I think it's different. I could really see a military style takeover of Greenland. I don't think anybody would die because I don't think anybody in Greenland would, resist. But you can see there's a lot of headway in annexing Greenland. I can definitely see Trump annexing Greenland in a way that I don't think in a million years he would ever annex Canada. But it's interesting. Like, it's crazy. And so what is causing that? What is that all about? Ian, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting to me to hear Chris saying that, Canadians are so upset about it, because when I see the Trump statements, I just see it as more Trump, because, he says stuff on it. So it's interesting to hear Canadians are that upset about it, because it doesn't sound like me or Billy Bob take those statements particularly seriously.
Well, that's actually a problem for us up here too, that nobody down there takes it seriously, and we're quite perplexed by that. I mean, we don't see when Trump says we're going to take over Canada, or he's insulting us every day, making disparaging remarks. There doesn't seem to be any protest among American talking heads or government officials about that. I saw Trump give a speech to some crowd in Las Vegas somewhere, several thousand people, and he said, we're going to take over Canada. Instead of somebody protesting, say, what are you, crazy? They all clapped and cheered.
Well, I mean,
we see that time and time again. They're all clapping and cheering. So, like, why? I mean, are we regarded as that little, as the nothing that? And the American population generally thinks they have the right to take over countries like this. I mean, there's no protest about the threats to take over Greenland or Panama. There are some people, you guys, but in the Democratic Party, there's no opposition to the Democratic Party.
Chris, here's the thing, because this is, I mean, what Trump's saying, I mean, saying it as often and as loudly as him is a bit unusual, but I mean, it's a near daily occurrence. Someone saying we need to bomb somebody, we need to annex somebody. Here's the brutal, I'm going to be brutally honest with you. When McCain said we need to bomb Iran, when American politicians say horrible, I mean, just horrible, like ghoulish things about Russia, and less often, but sometimes about China. I don't see Europeans, and I don't see Canadians, and I don't see, or for that matter, anybody else in the Commonwealth protesting. It seems to me, and this is just me being, I don't mean to offend anybody here, but it's just the brutal truth is that Europeans and Commonwealth citizens don't care if they say we're going to murder Iranian children, we're going to murder Russian children. No, they don't even say a word, or they actually silently agree with it. But when
I agree with you. Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. I don't disagree with you. It's quite true. And that country is one of the worst for doing these things. You're right. I'm just saying, for Canadian people, not their government, because the people, like the American people, I see them different from the government, even though they vote for these people. I'm just telling you, there's a lot of anger in this country. It's nationwide. It's 95% of the people are really very, very angry. And really, there's almost a hatred in the United States right now. It's gotten that bad. There's people, because it's not just the threats to attack us, because the only way it could annex us is to attack us.
Yeah.
In war. It's the continuous insults. And if we were Russia, well, you know, that they regard us together, they want to take us down. We all know that. So the insult is that's par for the course. When Canada's done everything they've asked, it's been one of the essential vassal states.
I think
people are like, what the hell? We've done everything you want, and now all you do is suddenly start insulting us and laughing at us and mocking us. It's just gone beyond the pale. I mean,
that's the essence of Trump. That's the essence of the American psyche. We're number one. That's the heart of it. You know, they think they know everything. Trump thinks he knows everything. He says it. I know better than anybody else.
Yeah.
I probably over and over again. He said that. You don't think he goes to bed with the wet dream of a Riviera on the Eastern Mediterranean every night with all that oil and natural gas right out there for the taking beyond the hapless Gazans? He's got that in his head.
Mm-hmm.
Who do you think came up with the invasion of Canada idea? Trump.
But it's the same thing with Canada, right? So he sees the Canadian resources, a lot of a lot of rare earth minerals. I mean,
tar sands.
So he wants access to that. He wants unfettered access, and that's, I think, what is the motivation behind these statements. Again, I don't think he's ever going to invade or, you know, forcibly militarily take over Canada, but he's definitely willing to crash your economy. I'm sure he's willing to crash, and I think he has the power to sanction you and crash your economy until you capitulate and sign over your shit. And
never
that's
happen.
It'll
never. Oh, it'll be like Cuba. They'll never happen. I misunderstood. He underestimates us. Then, even though we're vassals, there comes a point where we stop being that, and he can crash the economy. It's not going to affect.
I hope that's true. I hope Canada develops a backbone. What I think is going to happen is you're going to come to a deal. This is Trump's approach, right? Like he denounced North Korea with fire and fury, threatened them, and then he meets them. And I mean, that's just classic Trump. And I think that's what's going on with Canada. I think ultimately the government, whatever government ends up coming to power, will, under threat of legitimate threat of sanctions and of really hurting your economy, is going to come to some agreement. And that's I think Greenland might actually be annexed, but I think with Canada it's just talk, it's threats to get unfettered access to resources, and all of this is in preparation for a serious escalation of security competition, particularly with China, but also with all of the the axis of resistance, all of the countries, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, Iran, Yemen, Russia, China. So this is the axis of resistance that the United States is preparing the battlefield to have a significant escalation in this, what they call security competition. I think we could, Trump is quite possibly could nuke Iranian energy facilities. I think that's within the realm of possibility. And again, this could lead to a global economic collapse, right? Supply chains, energy, energy trade networks would just collapse, and it would be catastrophic. But think of it like this, right? If what we're talking about, if what you read in Zero Hedge is true, and I'm losing my train of thought. So if what you read in Zero Hedge about what
Well, yeah, because you're right. If he attacks Iran and Iran destroys the oil fields in the Middle East or shuts the Strait of Hormuz, that cuts off China's oil supply.
But if the U.S. is already facing a recession, right? If they're already facing a huge collapse due to the 33 trillions in debt, like they really have no other choice. So it's kind of like the Great Reset. They're going to push this button. Before they push the button, they're going to get all their pieces in place on the board, and then they're going to push this button. But if they're thinking that it's going to collapse anyway, that to me, and that's plausible. I think, like you said, we've been putting off this collapse of the capitalist system, the global economy. It's unstable and it's unsustainable, and all we've been doing is perpetuating it by printing money, right? Quantitative easing, and that can't go on forever. Like, that's not a sustainable approach. And so in order to, they're going to collapse it at a time of place of their choosing. And before they do that, they're going to have these pieces in place on the board. So that's kind of what I see is going on. And it's quite likely that, yeah, Trump will initiate a war against Iran. And that is going to be the catalyst to start this global economic crisis. And then you're going to just really see the world will change forever, right? I mean, it'll change forever, and the rules-based order that we've all known for the past several generations since the end of World War II will never again. It'll be irrevocably gone, and who knows? But so the question is the entirety of the Western ruling class on board with this, or are they hoping to manage Trump and get him out and then try and go back to business as usual with whoever comes after him? And I mean, when I think about it, I'm like, no, you can't go back to business. Business as usual will not be going back to. Business as usual is gone for good, and the future is uncertain, and it's going to definitely get a lot worse because it's the Western oligarchs that are going to be in this security competition, doing everything they can to weaken these governments that they don't control and strengthen themselves. And by strengthening themselves, not through the liberal means, right? Not through the rules-based order, but through might. Might makes right, and that's going to be the paradigm that is going to be. We're going to see that. I mean, we're already seeing it, but we're going to see that paradigm rolled out in spades, especially in our own region. Might makes right with Venezuela and accessing these resources, annexing Greenland. Well, I mean, is that a lawful act to annex Greenland? I mean, of course, it hasn't happened yet, so I'm speculating, but that's my speculation.
No, it's a possible scenario, maybe even probable, because something strange is going on. It's almost, I mean, one can say that fascism has actually arrived in the West again. And we've been talking about it for decades, but maybe it really has arrived, whereby legal means are abandoned and power becomes, the state rules by power and military corporate connection or partnership, and war is the way out of their debacle. So for that a world that would result in world war. So the war against Russia to try and take it apart is failing, but they're still going to try to continue. So a war against Iran, yeah. We see an attack on the working class across the Western world, from Europe and the UK. They're going to cut social services there, and France, Germany, maybe in Canada.
The working class has no power. The working class is completely disenfranchised from the political system, and that's exactly how they want it. And the working class can't oppose what they're trying to do. Like, we have no power. So that's the situation that they find themselves. The oligarchs put themselves in this situation on purpose, and now they're going to take advantage of it, right? They're going to take advantage of the divisions, of the weakness of the people, and they're going to do what they need to do to, maintain their hegemony throughout the rest of the 21st century. Because
so do you think then that maybe the so-called deep state, whatever that is, the powers behind the thrones, have gotten rid of Biden and thrown up Trump again to try and effect this policy?
Yeah, no, I think, Trump is a vehicle that they're using because he's a perfect vehicle to end the liberal system and turn towards a more might makes right paradigm, a more fascist paradigm. So that's my speculation, is that he has their backing. And I think that's true, because if you look at the Democrats, are the Democrats really in opposition to anything he's doing? No, they're giving lip service, complaining about him. They're not lifting a finger to do anything. This ridiculous AOC Bernie, what are they doing? Like it's just silly. But no, I think Trump is the vehicle, the necessary vehicle for this change, this shift in paradigm away from the old rules-based liberal order to this new might makes right security competition that will be escalated very shortly. And Vance could be, the heir apparent to that, and he could continue that after 4 years of Trump, or they could just amend the Constitution and give Trump another 4 years after this 4 years.
Well, it's interesting. I like that. I like that notion. It's interesting because if you look at the CIA, other than the USAID and the NED being thwarted in some of their efforts, almost coincidentally, the CIA has been untouched by also, like the military-industrial complex, has been untouched by the Trump administration. So there's still that.
Well, I'd just like to read a short quote, because it just came up again. This is written by Joseph Roth, who wrote a very famous novel, The Radetzky March. He's an Austrian, wrote it in the 1930s. But he said in 1933 to Stefan Zweig, another Austrian writer, after the election of Hitler, he wrote to him a letter saying, "You will have realized by now that we are drifting towards great catastrophes. Apart from the private, our literary and financial existence is destroyed. It all leads to a new war. I won't bet a penny on our lives. They have succeeded in establishing a reign of barbarity. Do not fool yourself. Hell reigns."
Did he write that recently, or is that like
he wrote that in 1933 when Hitler took power?
Yeah,
and I think it's an apt quote now, because I think that's what's taking place now.
There's parallels. There's definitely parallels.
I mean, what's the take from Ian? What's the take in Russia and all these on the negotiations, on the war, on the position of the West and everything? What's the general, or what's your feeling there in the atmosphere there? People, what they think of things, or what do you think of things? You're there.
Well,
let me interject. Ian, let me interject and let me promote your new Substack, which really gets at the heart of the question that Chris just asked.
Oh, okay.
So you do have a new Substack where you are discussing Russian media, right?
Yes, and the reason and it's in the description, and the reason I created that is because the English language media that people read about Russia in Western countries tends to, even when it's not completely slanted one particular way or another, it's, I think, probably only 30 or 40% of the major events that happen actually make it onto English media. Even Russian controlled English language media, and by that I mean like the English the English sites and content for major companies like RT, TASS, and the others tend to have. I mean, because again, it's a different language, so it's a different editorial team. I'm not sure who they've been using after the sanctions started, but there's an editorial. There's definitely a different editorial focus. I think a lot of it is controlled by Western expats in Russia or even hired to work remotely in other countries. So it's, I think people often get a skewed picture of what Russian media, internal audiences, what Russian media is saying and what Russians are thinking. So that's why I created this Substack. So, and I just take highlights of what I think is significant. I look at those feeds as Russian language feeds, and what I thought was particularly noteworthy, and try to compile it all in one place so people who are interested can come take a look at it. And also another advantage to that, and he's sharing it.
Oh, okay,
so if you scroll down, you can see I've been trying to have an update daily. That's interesting. I don't know why. I guess Substack makes you sign in to see the whole thing. But that's interesting. I haven't actually tried to look. That's interesting because I have not tried looking at my own page logged in, so I didn't know it's even like that. And that's probably my fault. And that I need to go find a setting to make it public, the whole thing public facing. Maybe if you click on posts, try clicking on posts. You see posts. Try that. Oh, okay. That's interesting. I feel like that might be a setting I need to change. But anyways,
that's interesting what you just raised there, the NATO aggression against Yugoslavia, because it's the anniversary last night and this morning for the beginning of the attack on Yugoslavia in 1999.
Yes, and that was very big in Russia, of course, in Russian media. Even in Russian language, Russian English media, it was less of a big thing. But internally, it's a very big date. It was a very significant geopolitical event from the Russian perspective. But you wouldn't really know that from looking at Western media.
No, but I was at this conference in at Russia House in Belgrade in late November, arranged by the Russians. I was invited to speak, and at the head of the Duma spoke there, and Primakov was there. I met him, and Deputy Prime Minister of Serbia, Vulin, gave a very, very strong anti-NATO speech. But Primakov was very good. Was it Pushulin? Pushlin? Head of the Duma? I can't remember. He was also very good. So they seem to be, the Russians have had 2 conferences on a NATO attack on Yugoslavia in the last year. And I'm told that they're intending to do something to bring them to account somehow, the people who were involved in that attack. I'm not sure what they intend. But they're beginning to have a focus on the NATO attack. They've had 2 big conferences, and I think they're planning another one.
So the main thing is, I want to actually address your question of what Russians think. So I think what Putin said a couple of months, I don't know if it was a month ago, probably about a month ago at this point, he basically said that, I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember the exact quote, but basically the vassals would come, the dog would stand by his master, gently wagging his tail. That was his statements that, despite all of the Trump rhetoric and the tariffs and the threatening and all of that, the U.S. aligned countries would still all follow direction from Washington and not turn against it. And I think so far that's proved to be accurate. I haven't seen anyone just say, we're going to do our own thing. No, I haven't seen anybody do that. They tolerate it because they have to tolerate it. They don't have a choice in the matter. And so, even if you talk to Russians, individual Russians, not in the government, just your average everyday Russian, that's more or less what they think too, that you have, that's Europe and the UK and the Crown, if you will, are not a pole in the multipolar worlds. They follow along with what the U.S. says, and they're unhappy that the new president is
Macron has a
more.
lot of power, Ian. Macron is very important.
The crown is very important. Maybe it was when they still had India. Now it's not so much, unfortunately, for them.
When they lost India, the empire fell apart.
Yes, that was it.
Although you're right, because we see when the Trump ordered the bombing of Yemen, the British took part in that, and yet there was supposedly some split between Starmer and and Trump, and yet the British Royal Air Force and the American Air Force hit Yemen together. So they're still acting in concert, like everything is going on as before.
They're also,
yeah, and the fact is they're more upset that Hegseth was mean to them. Even just at the beginning of the show, they were more upset that he said mean things than they are about the fact that he bombed a residential neighborhood in Yemen.
Of course, that doesn't even come up. No, that doesn't even come up. That's true.
But if you're a globalist, you're just looking at where the wealth is for you, and your own personal advantage. That's the one thing that strikes me about the European Parliament, how these people work to their own advantage, and when they find it or think they find it, they hold on to it. The interesting thing about France, for example, right now, for me, is the new confederation in Africa. That is Mali, Niger, and of course Burkina Faso and Ibrahim Traore. I mean, and I think it's the Malian leader. I can't want to pronounce his name, but he also tossed out 3 Chinese corporations because he didn't feel that they were living up to their contracts. So there's a kind of clearing the air down there. Of course, Traore's done the most magnificent job, but Niger went from being a debtor nation to a nation that was immediately pulled out of debt by simply taking the uranium and charging global rates for it, instead of being satisfied for 40 cents on the $72.62 it was raising, or whatever it was at the market. So there's the fact that Europe can, and France in particular, colonial France has to give up these resources, is a sign of real weakness. And I think in part, I mean, not to mention that maybe finally Africa, through coups of all things, are starting to get some reasonable leadership, some caring leadership. We'll have to see how it turns out.
Except in Central Africa and the Congo, and the war with Rwanda has been going on since 1996 and doesn't end. Millions dead, nobody cares. And they egg it on because the West takes resources, oil and gas and minerals out of Katanga and Eastern Congo for free because it's so chaotic, they don't have to pay any royalties. So it benefits them to keep this war going. And Kagame and Museveni, who are involved in this war, nobody touches them. They're mass murderers. They all talk to them, meet with them. Nobody touches them.
Yeah.
And then we have Duterte being picked up by the ICC. That's a strange thing. The Philippine leader ends up in The Hague when they have no jurisdiction over him for police actions inside Philippines. That's bizarre.
So we're touching on, at the very end of our show, Chris, we're touching on these areas that are your expertise. So you were on the defense team for one of the the people that were being prosecuted along with Milosevic, right? Back in
well, I was one of Milosevic's lawyer before he was assassinated by NATO. Probably the Americans or British. Well, the Americans told me they poisoned him. But,
oh yeah, I totally believe that. They didn't have a case against him, and so they just assassinated him in his cell, essentially.
Yeah, they had to. Otherwise, if they couldn't convict him legitimately. They couldn't release him because he would be a big power figure in the Balkans again, so they had to kill him. So they killed him.
And then you also represented one of the Rwandan.
Yeah, general. He was the head of the national police in Rwanda, and he was charged with like 40 counts of genocide, so on. He was acquitted on all of them because the entire narrative about that war is false, and we were able to persuade the judges that it was false. Took several years to convince them. And so he was acquitted and now is in Belgium, in Brussels.
So
but the war in Congo still goes on, and that's all.
Yeah.
It comes out of that. It comes out of the Rwanda war.
But I'm thankful that they didn't just own the judges. Like, I have no faith in the international court, and like they could just as easily have owned all those judges, bought them off, and then you're that guy would have never been acquitted. Fortunately, it wasn't important. It wasn't worth the investment maybe in the judges to prosecute, to get him.
The way they controlled that, yeah, they propagandized the judges. They briefed them and told them a lot of nonsense when they took the position, and they were convinced that was the way it was. So these guys were guilty from the get-go, and that was their attitude in court for a long time. And it took us a long time to present a lot of evidence to swing these guys over. And when this general was acquitted, I got a message from the chief judge in my trial telling me that the Americans had ordered the judges, to convict him of something. And and if we didn't convict him of something, we were going to face trouble. But we refused but we got other threats. So they were also threatened because the CIA was controlling the tribunal there.
And so what is the end game with Duterte? They definitely removed him from the country as a political force, because right now he is actually in The Hague being arraigned. His daughter was part of the coalition government with Marcos, and then they've had a big split there, and I think she's been marginalized and sidelined in some way. But this is definitely an attack on the faction within the Philippines that has a sensible foreign policy towards China. If you don't hate China, and if you don't toe the U.S. line, and sacrifice your society on behalf of the West's war against China, we're going to do all these things to you. That's just the clear message it's sending.
Exactly, and that's what they did with President Gbagbo of Ivory Coast in 2011. When the elections took place there, he was elected. The French didn't want him in power. They wanted their man named Ouattara, who was a puppet of theirs, in power. So they conducted a coup the day after the election, overthrew Gbagbo, contacted the prosecutor of the ICC, Ocampo, the Argentinian lawyer, and got him to agree that, and before the coup, and said, if we pick him up, we want you to detain him as long as possible. We'll send him to you, and you detain him in The Hague for as long. And that's what they did. So they arrested him, kidnapped him, sent him to The Hague. The Hague charged him with trumped up charges, like fake charges. And he was held in jail for 10 years. And then he was released last year, a year and a half ago. And the judges said there was no evidence whatsoever. And they never produced any evidence against him because there wasn't any. So the ICC acted as a tool of French imperialism to take out an elected official, to put in their puppet. And now they're doing the same thing with the Philippines, removing a political figure in opposition in the Philippines and dragging him to The Hague, when they have no jurisdiction over the Philippines at all, especially not for police actions.
Right. They're not even a signatory to the International Caucasian Court.
No, they were, but they retracted it several years ago. So it's bizarre.
It's not called the International Caucasian Court, but for all intents and purposes, that's how it operates, because they never indict any Western white war criminals. All of them deserve indictment.
Well, they've indicted Putin, President Putin. They've indicted Netanyahu, but they're never going to arrest Netanyahu, and they've never charged Zelensky or anybody, only the Russians. So it's all, you can see how the ICC works. And this guy Khan is connected to MI6, I'm sure.
And there's
The
two
prosecutor.
courts, right? There's the ICC and the ICJ.
Right. And the ICJ is a legitimate court and part of the UN system,
Okay.
but it only deals with debates or disputes between nations about interpretations of treaties and so on. It's not a criminal court.
So it's less corrupt and less of a tool for Western imperialism than the ICC is.
Yeah, though it's also infected in a way, but you saw that when the South Africans brought the case against Israel, which was a great thing to do. But the ICJ refused to order the Israeli forces to withdraw from Gaza, claiming they didn't have the authority. And yet just 18 months before, when Ukraine brought a case before the ICJ complaining about Russia committing genocide against Ukrainians, they ordered the Russian army to leave. So they set a precedent just 18 months before and then claimed they couldn't do such a thing with Israel. So you can see that even they are, because of the way the judges are chosen and how they're selected and who they're connected to, there's also a political overtone to that court as well.
A lot of hypocrisy, like with Yugoslavia. The United States claimed that they had the right to protect who are they protecting? They were protecting the Serbs. No, they were
the Albania or the Albanian people being oppressed in Kosovo, which never took place.
Right.
But
and where's the responsibility to protect the Gazans or the Palestinians? Where's that? Or to protect the Yemenis?
How come Putin can't protect the Russians in East Donbass? So that's the hypocrisy.
Right.
Although Russia could use that rationale, but they never have claimed the right to protect. They've used the right of self-defense. That's their rationale for going into Ukraine, and I think they're correct legally. They could have used responsibility to protect and humanitarian intervention, which the West has used, but the Russians are not that hypocritical, so they didn't use that.
Okay, I don't want to cut the discussion, but I need to get going because dinner is here, so I need to.
So, Shaniqua, I see that you're watching. You're a longtime viewer. Thank you for posting your applause comment. We're very thankful for you and all of our viewers and commenters. We will reconvene probably on Friday, but thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you then. Bye.
All right.
All right.
See you later.
Good to see everyone.